Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Darren Walker. I am lucky enough to serve as president of the Ford Foundation. And today I am wearing a blue sweater, a blue and white shirt. I am an African-American man with a bald head and eyeglasses on that are clear. I am delighted to be here at home with books, a library around me, because we are going to hear from a great friend of mine, a remarkable, amazing woman. Her name is Jacqueline Novogratz, and she has written a book, and that book is called A Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. And that book is going to transform your thinking as a leader, how you manage and run your organizations. So please join me in welcoming my friend Jacqueline Novogratz. Welcome, Jacqueline, and I'm sorry that my four-legged little girl has decided that this is the moment she wants the world to know about her. But we won't talk about Mary Lou because we're here to talk to you, Jacqueline, and this book, this amazing book. So talk to me first, Jacqueline, and let everyone know, because not everyone knows your story and the story of Acumen, which when I first met you some 20 plus years ago, you had this idea, and it was truly just an idea, an unprecedented, radical idea of investing for social and financial return. Talk about Acumen and the journey that brought you to this moment.
Well, thank you, Darren. And first, just for our listeners, I'm a white woman with medium length hair and a necklace on, and I'm just so happy to be here. And when you said you're so lucky to be the president of the Ford Foundation, let me just say the world is lucky to have you in that place in this moment, and I couldn't be happier to be here. Truly. When you look at the principles of this book, which we will get to, you live them, and they're not easy to live, which is why I called them the practices. So the story of Acumen, you were there at Rockefeller, and in some ways it's been the story of where Ford is too right now, in that I had started in the early 80s on Wall Street, mostly in the developing world in Latin America, where I had seen the power of markets and how investment as a tool really could unleash entrepreneurship and ideas and jobs. But I also saw how particularly excluded poor people, even from going through their doors. And then that sent me off on this journey where I ended up in Rwanda and helped co-found the first microfinance bank in 1986 in Rwanda with a small group of Rwandan women. And there I saw that markets only made sense if you built the excluded's capability to interact with those markets. And that too often top-down approaches to development, to aid, to charity, government can create dependency. And that at the end of the day, and this was really hit home with the genocide, we make a mistake by thinking the opposite of poverty is income or wealth. The opposite of poverty is dignity, it's choice, it's freedom, it's the ability to have agency in your lives. And so when we were both at Rockefeller and the world was changing so fast back then in the late 90s, and we were becoming more interconnected, it seemed very clear that there was an opportunity to take the best of the markets and the best of philanthropy and create a new approach, which was what we called the big idea of patient capital. Acumen was based on this notion that we needed to change the way we tackled poverty by raising philanthropy and then investing long-term, I'm talking 10 to 15 year investment capital, equity or debt, in entrepreneurs that were trying to solve big problems like energy, housing, healthcare, agriculture, education, and we would accompany those entrepreneurs with our social capital, our access to networks, technology, talent, which we underestimated and we can talk about. And we try to measure what mattered, and any money that came back, we would reinvest. And we've changed a lot since then, but we've seen the power of that model of patient capital by leveraging another $1 billion to change the lives of 300 million people. And we've moved along a journey as well, where we're also now focusing on human talent, human capital, and more traditional impact investing to actually grow our companies.
And, you know, you were very helpful to me on the journey here at Ford around our mission-related investment portfolio, building that portfolio. The trustees, as you know, allocated $1 billion towards this mission-related investing strategy. And one of the real challenges that you have identified early on was how difficult it has been to get philanthropy, who sits on billions of investable dollars, to see the potency of this approach as one way of contributing to their mission of poverty alleviation or reducing inequality or helping women and girls. All of these things have been demonstrated through the Acumen model. But talk about, you know, you were there, you were at Rockefeller, you were, you know all about organized philanthropy. Why has it been so difficult? And why haven't we seen more billions? I mean, let me just be totally candid here. My own institution, the Ford Foundation, was not ready when I first proposed. The board was definitely not there in terms of understanding the power of this idea.
You know, Darren, I couldn't agree with you more. And what's interesting is we do stand on the shoulders of those who came before, and change is too slow. And in this moment of reckoning, I do think we really share an urgency to make it go a whole lot faster. When I first started Acumen way back in the day, 2001, Wall Street would say, look, I make my money here and I give it away there. In a way, philanthropists, foundations really live that same corollary. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give away 5%, even if it is to try to change a status quo that I am reinforcing with my other 95%. And part of the problem is our whole system continues to put profit at its center, and individualism. And until we decide that we will change that system, we're going to be stuck in this cycle. And so when you, Darren, because it was really your leadership, so we're going to put $1 billion into mission-related investments, it was like a tectonic shift in the overall sector, because you were saying, we have this huge endowment. That's capital. And I think the point that we're missing is that philanthropy should be the most risk-oriented capital that we have. And it is too often where we see the least amount of risk. We have a spectrum at our disposal that goes from grants, which are critically needed, even in the impact space, I'd almost say, especially in the impact investing space. We have this middle ground of patient capital, where getting our money back so that we can reinvest it is amazing. And frankly, getting 80% so that we can reinvest it because financial sustainability matters is critical. And then as these entities grow, there's more room for more traditional impact investing. The conversation still is way too bifurcated, where I think we've confused means and ends. And so those who sit with the responsibility of growing an endowment are focused on using investment as a tool to make more money, when this moment requires us to use investment in service of solving problems. And that is the opportunity for philanthropy today.
And what would you say as you traveled the world, and I want to get to your assessment of the COVID situation though, but as you have traveled the world meeting with investors, you have all the credentials, you have the Stanford MBA, you worked on Wall Street. What has been the response in the private capital markets to your idea and the take up of this model?
Well, in the beginning, it was quite humiliating, frankly. It was, oh, that's such a naive idea. You clearly don't understand how business operates. And I'm like, well, I did start a bank. I do have a Stanford MBA. I did work on Wall Street. I am almost 40. But it was seen as too controversial, and that it was muddled, that it was fuzzy, that it was like a houseboat. And
Oh, I remember that famous statement by a well-known venture capitalist in Silicon Valley.
And so what's exciting today, though, to go into an optimistic note, Darren, is that we have not only single companies that have created entire sectors now. In 2007, 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity. Well, if we waited around either for the markets or government to just solve it, we might still be there 150 years after Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And that's not just an unjust situation. It is a deeply problematic and dangerous situation. And so the power of patient capital, impact investing, and then government was that now we're down to about 700 million. Still a completely immoral situation. That 700 million people on this planet cannot turn on a light bulb. On the other hand, watching the power of a different kind of capital approach invest and build, and how that then released an off-grid solar revolution has been extraordinary to be a part of it. And so I think I stand a lot less tentatively, a lot less apologetically, because there is such power. And some of the things that are really exciting me, Darren, and I think it's been brought on by this moment of breaking open our systems, Black Lives Matter, that has said, business as usual just ain't gonna cut it, is that philanthropist foundations, business leaders are shifting. We have a company called Everytable in Los Angeles, which is run by one of those change makers that really just looks at capital as something to control rather than to be controlled by, which is part of our manifesto. After starting a nonprofit in Los Angeles, where he hoped to teach people about getting healthier food in food deserts, he realized that there weren't really the green groceries to buy from. Your only option really was McDonald's. And so he built Everytable as a fast, affordable, healthy alternative. And we always assumed a pricing model that would have to somewhere be subsidized, but people so appreciated having healthy, affordable, nutritious food that it quickly grew from 1 to 8 restaurants that included takeout. When COVID hit, he pivoted on that day. And he said, look, my purpose is getting people healthy food. And so you need us to deliver it, we'll deliver it. If you can't afford to pay, we'll deliver it anyway. And if you're willing to pay it forward, here's a link. And the outpouring of individual little philanthropy allowed them to deliver hundreds of thousands of meals. And then they partner with government. By now they've delivered over 3 million meals with this new business model. And in so doing, they thought, okay, well, what's the next step? If you want to take business as a model, there's a racial justice and equity opportunity here. And so foundations like Kellogg and Dignity Health and then the California Wellness Foundation took off from what the Ford Foundation did in the 60s. And they created a PRI. They've raised about 3 million now of what they hope will be 13 million. I think it's a 2% interest over 7 years to allow people that go through the newly created Everytable University to take those employees who really show entrepreneurial verve and capability and train them for 6 months to a year. Give them the opportunity to buy a franchise, only not like franchises are expected to be purchased in the rest of the United States. Prioritizing Black and Latinx people, not charging any money up front. securing a $40,000 per year salary for 3 years with the hope and the what we call the accompaniment to enable a new core of Black and Latinx entrepreneurs to own equity and wealth as they help solve the problems of this country. To me, even if people say, well, that's great, it's still not a huge model, it is a new kind of business model that wouldn't happen without the more revolutionary kind of thinking and focus on capital as a tool that we control rather than assuming, well, I'm a grant maker, so I can make grants. And you've really been part of that whole revolution. And I just think this is our moment, Darren.
Well, I think it certainly is your moment, and this is your second book. So now your manifesto is composed of 13. And I mean, Jacqueline, we could spend 2 hours talking about this revolution that's going to come if people practice. So my favorite one is the part of the manifesto that talks about listening to the voices of the unheard. And I love how you understand implicitly that people have voices. You know, sometimes I've heard philanthropists say things like, we give voice to the voiceless, or and I've just thought, they have voices. We just don't listen to them. We've never centered their voices, but don't say we give them voice. We don't give them voice. And I love how you capture that here. So talk about that. And obviously, as you explained in the book, this is all from your traveling the world. I mean, you weren't sitting, here in New York coming up with this stuff. Talk about that idea of hearing and listening.
Thanks, Darren. It actually doesn't surprise me that is where you went, because you are such a listener. And I think that starts with a belief that every human being has that potential and has a voice. The book is really filled with my mistakes and failures, and the beginning of this adventure mirrors many of the mistakes and failures I made in my life, starting with when I went to West Africa as a 25-year-old with this idea that I would save the world. And it didn't take long for very strong West African women to let me know that I was not exactly the model that they were looking for. And I think that sent me off on a different kind of listening journey, realizing that people had so much to say. In the book, where I start is with a young man named Vimal Kumar, who's from the scavenger caste, which in India is the lowest of the Dalits, the untouchable caste. And for many, many generations, as you know, this is a caste that has been consigned to picking up human waste. And he had made it into the Acumen Fellowship Program, which is part of our university to encourage moral leadership. And I was so intrigued, where did this young man come from? And so I said, let's meet at this restaurant, a coffee shop on a Sunday afternoon, hot day. And sitting there, and the guy's 10 minutes late. And I think, this just doesn't make sense, given power, frankly. And so I thought, I wonder if, maybe he didn't feel like he could come into the restaurant by himself. And I went out, and sure enough, there he was. And I hugged him and came in and said, so Vimal, what do you want to eat or drink, anything? And he said, no, I'm really not hungry. I'm not thirsty. We sat down. We talked for a couple of hours. It was an extraordinary conversation. And it was only a year later when we were thinking back to that day and really talking about the time we met each other. And I said, I felt so stupid that I just sat there not even thinking about you coming in. And he said, yeah, and I was so thirsty and hungry that day. And I said, were, but I asked you. And he said, well, I didn't go in because I didn't have any money in my pocket. And what if somebody asked me to buy something? It was too scary for me. And then what if you asked me to share the bill? And I said, I just so assumed that I would pay for you. And I thought, here I am like Miss Listener. And I missed it. And I think that the idea of listening is not just about our ears. It is listening with all parts of ourselves, particularly to those people for whom there haven't been a lot of people to ask them questions. And those people who have asked them questions don't necessarily want to hear the truths that they might have to tell, or at least they think you might not want to hear the truths that they have to tell. And so easier not to tell. And I have to say, Darren, during Black Lives Matter, Vimal was in Washington where he got this big fellowship. And hearing Vimal teach everyone on our Path of Moral Leadership online course about the perspectives of an untouchable in the age of COVID, where suddenly the untouchables became the essential workers, and just reflecting his voice and what he saw in this country was one of the great gifts. And it started in I think learning to listen in different ways to each other.
Well, and as you see that connection between the lived experience of lower castes and even within the caste, the lowest, and seeing the experience of people of African descent globally, knowing that you see this sense of what I believe is an almost anti-Blackness. I mean, wherever we are, whether it's the favelas of Brazil or the rural villages or the slums in Delhi, we see a sense that those who are most dispossessed are the Blackest, are the darkest. And I wonder if there is not some, the reason people were resonating in the United States and would be resonating as I've experienced when you raise this in places like Brazil is the history of how these people have been marginalized in their own societies, in part because of caste. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson, who I interviewed in the last book talk, Isabel talks about this. And as you know, I'm sure you read her book. I mean, she really makes the case that caste is a global phenomenon.
It is absolutely a global phenomenon. Remember, I work in many countries where skin whitener is kind of de rigueur. And you see a lot more billboards for skin whitener than you do for safe drinking water or affordable housing or how to get solar electricity. And
not only in India, now in Africa.
And in Africa. And in Africa. The other piece, and I think it's what you're getting to with listening, and it's actually, ironically, in this moment of so much anti-capitalism, it's actually where markets, when used correctly, can play a powerful role as a listening device, is that when the world has told you over and over and over that you don't matter, that you aren't included, that you don't count, it starts to get internalized in yourself too. And I actually learned this a long time ago when I was doing this little bakery in Rwanda with 20 women who society called prostitutes, but if you actually talk to them, they were just single mothers. Sure, some of whom had no power whatsoever, and so they would have to sleep with landlords just to be allowed to stay in a shack with their child. And I remember when I had discovered through my other work the powerful anti-fragile qualities of sorghum and millet, which were indigenous crops. And so we started to make these beautiful breads that we were selling, and the rich expats would buy these beautiful breads, which were really inexpensive because these crops were inexpensive. But the the women in the bakery who were earned about, at the time we started, about 60 cents a day. We got them up to almost $4 a day, but
Wow.
it was amazing. But at the beginning, they would only eat the breads made with the weevil-ridden white flour imported, because that was for the rich people. And it was so confusing to me, this kind of vestige of colonial thinking
Right.
that they were stuck with. Meanwhile, these expats were like getting the benefits of what was so right and beautiful about what was home and locally grown. And I think that's very much connected. Where I say the market can be a listening device is that the problem with a traditional charity approach where we don't listen, is that it becomes very difficult for people to tell you what's working and what's not working if you've given them a gift. If you ask them to buy something, it at least opens the possibility of a more honest conversation. And if they can then have agency and participation in it, all bets are off. And what's been thrilling about our work in, again, using markets, but not being controlled by them, is to see that by solving a problem for and with entrepreneurs in East and West Africa, solar electricity, tens of thousands of jobs are created. They are not dead-end jobs. They end up becoming career paths. And watching the accumulation of voice as people make their own choices in their own way allows us to understand what they value, what works, what doesn't work, and has given us a lot more insight into the actual impact of our work, some of which is very humbling, but I think is something that philanthropy could really serve to do more of.
Well, you talk about audacity and humility. Those are part of the suite of principles you believe are so important. But philanthropists often talk about humility, but we don't always possess humility. And especially if you are a newly minted billionaire who has been enormously successful because you invented some piece of technology that has made you wealthy, the incentives around that philanthropist are pretty reinforcing, pretty affirming. They're not saying you're arrogant, you're not a good listener, you lack humility, you aren't empathetic enough. I mean, they you believe you have the answer. And the humility part of your book is something, again, that you also learned on the journey.
Well, I don't want to let the rest of us off the hook by just pointing at the billionaires, but one thing I will say about the billionaires is that, I have a brother that got tremendously wealthy. So I remember,
I know,
as a little brother, and is still a little brother. And I remember talking to him about it, and he said, one thing I just never realized is that as soon as you get rich, it just seems your IQ goes up by at least 10 points. And it's what you're saying. People don't tell you the truth after that. And so I do think that there is a much greater trap that comes with sudden wealth, that you've been very successful as an entrepreneur in one place, so you should have the answer in another. And certainty can really kill real change. But I don't want to let the rest of us off the hook, because that so often in philanthropy, we almost think it's about our humility, but we play small, and therefore we make one-year grants, or small grants for programs that we like and choose. We're afraid of general operating, which if we were building companies, we would never accept that people got to choose small amounts of money for a particular piece of the business that they liked and ignore actually what it takes to hire the people that are needed to make the change. So we go small, we stay short term, we do only the things that we really want to do. And after a couple of years, we might decide we don't want to do that anymore, so we move. And in all of those four things is actually a lack of humility. But it's safe, but it doesn't necessarily lead to change. The most courageous and audacious philanthropy is multi-year, general operating, where we've made a commitment. We use the phrase "a company." We've made a commitment to make the grantee's problem our own. Not that we're there to solve it for them, but that we are there to help build the muscle so they can solve it for themselves. And I think that within that is the tension between humility and audacity. And actually, Darren, Ford helped us start to study and understand this more deeply in Latin America, where our work is in post-conflict. And so you want to make change in a post-conflict area in a truly wounded community, and we got enough of our own in the United States. Go to a country that's had 50 years of civil war, where you still have a lot of drugs and distortions in the market that does exist, and find ways to build true community capability. That's not a short-term problem, nor is it a short-term fix. And so the audacity to believe that we can build businesses as a tool of peace requires the humility of understanding the level of woundedness, the fact that you're working in situations with no trust, very few skills, hardly any infrastructure, and as I said, lots of distortions, either with aid or with the narcotics industry that is flowing through. And the example I would give is a company called Gigante Wet Mill, where we helped build a company that we own 50% of, 49% of, 300 farmers own the other 51% of. It took about 3 years partnering with TechnoServe and Nespresso just to get them to the point where we could build the structure of the company. This over 10 years, they will pay off our debt, at the end of which, again, they will own the equity. It's not about a single hero. It's not about impact investing where we're going to brag about our returns. It's about a transfer of ownership and power to, as you said, go to the coast of Colombia where things are the worst, and you're looking at Colombians who truly have been without voice and who truly deserve to have a deep voice because they understand the situation they're in and they want to get out of it. And they don't want to be seen as poor, and they're not looking for charity. You talk about it in from generosity to in the new gospel, but from that generosity is so much easier than justice. And I think that is the journey we need to go on in philanthropy, that we need to be part of that journey toward justice. And we have the tools, but we've got to recognize they're in our control. And when it's slower, when there are more mistakes, when you have to learn how to communicate and, more importantly, to listen, you don't always look very smart from the outside. And I've gone through struggles of, well, Acumen, it's still small over there. And it's like, well, we moved $1 billion and supported 300 million people. Like, how big do you need to be? And then it's like, wait a minute. What does healing look like? What does building really look like? And shouldn't it be the philanthropists that are imagining and then daring to build that new world in partnership? That's the moral.
That's so beautiful, Jacqueline. And I think your message, your admonition to philanthropists about general operating support, about the investment capital to institution build is something that we have internalized at Ford. And our build strategy and our own grant making, we've gone from 21% to over 80% general operating support in our grant making this year. We anticipate we'll do over $1 billion of grants in this fiscal year, and over 80% of that will be unrestricted support, because we believe in institutions. And I think this is one of the things that we philanthropists also find ourselves trapped in. And this is the sort of chasing the new innovation, the new idea, the new shiny object, and which is great. But as you know from your work, institutions are what sustain and make possible transformation. And the best thinkers, the best innovators, the Jacqueline Novogratz, the Brian Stevensons of the world, while they may, in this generation, be social entrepreneurs, just as Gloria Steinem and Muhammad Yunus was a generation ago, all of you know that it will be the institutions, it will be Acumen, it will be the EJI. The Mies Foundation has had to sustain itself as an institution to carry forward that work. And that's why investing in general operating support, investing in the plumbing, the unsexy, no naming opportunities for philanthropists, that work is so important.
And Darren, where you're not giving yourself enough credit in institutions, there's also a need to constantly renew. And if you developed the PRIs in the 60s, you renewed with mission-related investment in the early 2000s, that there's the adage that if we are not willing to disrupt ourselves, and that means our own institutions, how dare we think that we will disrupt the world? And you have done that.
Well, but Jacqueline, who among us who are really privileged, you know, we like our institutions. We love at Rockefeller's, we were so proud and practically smug in our love for the RF and the amazing history, the pride that we had. But in some ways, and I saw that when I came to Ford as well. But that's one of the traps of legacy. I write in my book, in Generosity to Justice, how we become, as legacies, more preoccupied with preservation than innovation. And it was that innovation that made us provide something special for society, allowed us to contribute to poverty alleviation or whatever it may be. As you said, 1 billion people, amazing. But then what happens is our boards, the apparatus we build becomes so concerned about risk. And there's a risk management committee, and there's an audit committee, and then there's a comms person. And so everyone is worried about managing risk and reputational risk. And these ideas get fomented that actually keep Jacqueline Novogratz from being who she wants to be, because she's got to deal with all of this stuff around her saying, oh, but be careful, Jacqueline.
Okay, so Darren, you're killing me. We're turning 20 in April. And because of the pandemic, we're going to throw a big 21st day, when we become adults. Next April, it's 2022. And so I'm doing deep soul searching. I think both you and I probably agree, we've never had this conversation. But if you had told us when we were just starting out with these big dreams that we were going to change the world, that we would be fighting some of the ugliest corruption, bureaucracy, and complacency, I don't know if I would have fully believed you, because my worldview, I've never really experienced it in the way that we've had to deal with it, because if you're looking at water, healthcare, education, housing, these are very dirty industries. And so having been hammered at times as you've built and get pushed down and have to start again, I do think there's a part that has to really step back and renew and listen to the next generation and see where are we holding ourselves back? Where do we need to renew those ancient values? You know, Martin Luther King was right when he said that privilege doesn't give itself up voluntarily. And yet we're of a generation that is so privileged that we have to, and you are so eloquent here, we have to give if we are going to change these systems. And it is within our power to do so. It's really painful soul searching. And it's something I'm personally really doing a lot of right now. To think about, okay, we did a lot in 20 years. We better do double in the next 10. And,
Yes, yes.
and the world
Well, Jacqueline, we're going to go to questions because there are many questions. People want to hear from you, Jacqueline. So as someone who is a beneficiary of coming into contact with Darren Walker in his prison library, can you talk about the connection of moral leadership and getting proximate to people suffering from systems of oppression? Jacqueline, getting proximate.
Well, nobody can speak more eloquently about getting proximate than Brian Stevenson, who's on Darren's board. And I think it's probably where you hear so much consonance here. The word that we use and that I use is immersion. There's a great Tilly Olson quote that you know, may you live a life of immersion, but what price will you pay? And over and over, and this goes right to how we invest. If we find an entrepreneur sort of akin to what Darren was talking about before, who has a great idea, but hasn't fully immersed in understanding the people that he is there to serve, hearing it from their perspectives, to convince us that she has put herself in their shoes, as impossible as that is, and built a solution from there, and then has the ability to understand the system that holds them back, including where they might be holding themselves back. Then who cares if you're investing equity or grants? You're not going to succeed. And so immersion for the entrepreneurs is deeply critical. It's also critical for us. And it is where I've learned some of the most important lessons from the wisest people in the most unlikely of places. Get close, build from that perspective. And if you don't, probably shouldn't be in the game.
Well, there's a question about doing good and doing well. I mean, is this a myth, Jacqueline? I mean, it certainly is an idea that you have proselytized and have been an evangelizer for a long time.
Well, I've actually never used doing good by doing well, but I'm often associated with it. I think in terms of writ large, do no harm is your first step into true impact. It's not enough. The entrepreneurs that excite me and that we invest our capital in are driven first and foremost to solve a problem. They actually don't think about doing good by doing well. They put the farmers, they put our humanity at the center, and then they make everything else work. The most exciting ones that I think are creating our next chapter dare to reconstruct the market altogether. A guy named Tyler Youngblood, who went to Colombia to start a coffee company, understood that in a $200 billion industry, an enormous percentage of coffee farmers make under $2 a day. There's a reason that our average farmer in the world is 58 years old. And so he could have just said, well, global commodities prices will dictate what these farmers get paid. That's the way it's always been done. But instead, he dared to say, I'm going to find a way to create a system that starts with the poor, that starts with understanding production costs of the farmers, that negotiates a fair living wage, price that I can also set for 3 years, not 1 year, because all of us need to plan our lives. And low income people really value that planning and that stability much more than price fluctuations. And in being driven by that, rather than doing good by doing well, he has built a profitable company and brought in companies like Stumptown and other premium coffee buyers that want to know that the farmers are being treated well, are part of this community of trust, because they know that their customers care. And the more we can build these kinds of communities of trust, transparency,
Yep.
that put the right people at the center, the more that doing good by doing well becomes lovely, just not essential.
But do you think, because I am hearing from from questions like, Jacqueline, how do you know the person who represents themselves as the community representative is actually speaking on behalf of the community? So you're this outside white lady parachuting into Africa, and you meet this nice Kenyan, and he tells you, I'm representing the community, when actually he's up to something illicit. How do you get at that, right? Because you're the white lady from New York, they're in Nairobi. How do you know that this guy is on the up and up?
I mean, first of all, since we built Acumen from 5 years in, when we had the capability, it was clear that if we did not have all local teams on the ground surrounded by a local community, we weren't going to build an institution that could actually make the change. And so I am not the one that goes in and assesses and we have been burned. And sometimes I think that elites across the world know each other better than we do people in our own nations. And it is something that we should also really understand. I also, to move away from humility to my own, there is a level of arrogance that comes with getting old, Darren, and I bet that you are.
I can relate to that since I am very old.
I have sat in meetings with community leaders and with a young teammate, and I'll just be watching. I'm like, that is not the community leader. She is not real. And sure enough, we'll do a little digging. So I wouldn't upset us old ones, because we've seen enough across, humans are humans, that there are clues that you can pick up, but I would not dare be the one to say, this is who we are going to invest in. That is to our local teams and our local advisors. And I think that's part of what Brian Stephen talks about with proximity as well. The confidence comes from everything on the ground, deeply embedded.
And another question is really about, how do we think about unlocking endowments? What are the incentives? Part of your theory of change, I think, was that by demonstrating the efficacy of the idea, you would unlock capital.
Well, in some ways, we've unlocked enormous capital. But Darren, as you remember, when we started Acumen, we wanted to revolutionize philanthropy. I had no idea that that Acumen's approach actually fit with more of an ideological model in the financial sector. So that was, after 2008 with the financial crisis, and there was a real reckoning. It was the financial institutions that really moved into the impact investing space first. That was not what I had expected. And very soon you had early stage patient capital investing, which I still believe, I believe much more now than ever, is critical to get companies to the point where they can really grow. And then you had a whole group of impact investors that were looking for market returns, and they wanted to change, solve world hunger. That middle piece, that early growth piece, is still an enormous gap. And it is a place where foundations, and that's where Ford is really moving, have such an important role to play, because nobody wants to go into that territory. It's still high risk. You will not get 20% returns, but the change that can be made in very messy sectors like where you are, affordable housing, is extraordinary. And that is, that needs to be unlocked. Again, why is it not unlocked? We still seem to put a financial hat on that only looks at the financial returns, or we put a charity hat on, when in fact, we are here to walk each other's home. We are here to reimagine our systems. And if we really do care about racial equity, the inequality in our world, climate change, then we've got to fundamentally shift our systems and ask ourselves at every moment, what are we doing in service of a world that puts our humanity at the center, not just profit? And until we start to make that shift in our philanthropies, in our government, in our financial institutions, in our nonprofits, we'll be playing around more at the edges. And I think that is the work of, moral revolution. And Dan, we don't use it. I love that you don't use it in this way either. I'm not talking about righteousness. In fact, I'm almost talking about the opposite of righteousness. I'm talking about daring truly to put the collective above the individual, and daring truly to build institutions on behalf of others, not just our own selves or even our own reputations.
Well, Jacqueline Novogratz, you have, from the moment I met you at the Rockefeller Foundation, consistently astounded, amazed, and dazzled me and so many other people for your passion to change the world, for your belief in the idea that everyone deserves to live with dignity and to dream. And you have committed your life, your career, to helping making the dreams of people who are often the most left out, left behind, and dispossessed a reality. And it has been my pleasure to know you, to be your colleague, to be your friend, and to see the impact that you have made, the change that you have brought. This change is manifest in your great book. We are hoping and we are inspired by your call for a moral revolution. Thank you, Jacqueline Novogratz.
Well, Darren, I learn from you every time we speak, and I'm just continually inspired. And to call you a friend is a real honor of mine. And may you stay in good health, because we need the Ford Foundation. We need your leadership, and it's just always a privilege to be here with you, because we got work to do.
We've got work to do, Jacqueline. And speaking of, we probably are both moving on to a meeting or a Zoom or some engagement. That means we've got work to do. So thank you, dear friend. It's great to see you. Congratulations on the book. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today.
Thank you.